In today's clip, I'm going to claim my love for JRPGs, but really specifically the turn-based kind that originated by the Final Fantasy games before they got to the double digits at least. Ayo, XenPuck here. Oh, I'll definitely be leaning into my nerdishness today, since I want to talk about a genre of video games that I feel like are still somehow under the radar these days. I love me some old-fashioned RPGs, like the kind that I played when I was a teenager, starting around, oh my god, more than 20 years ago. Lord, I'm dating myself, aren't I? But that's true. I've never gotten over the genre, or subgenre rather, since I do believe in the broader culture. You know, even though nerds are cooler than ever, with the advent of gaming as a real hobby, that my interest in old school RPGs still yet remains a bit of an outlier. Of course, we gotta define a few things, right? Number one, what subgenre of RPGs am I talking about? Well, RPGs in video gaming at this point is a pretty big group these days. I'm not talking about Mass Effect or like Dragon Age or Knights of the Old Republic here, right? Though I do love me some KOTOR as well, right? These are what I would consider more Western style RPGs, you know, where the world is mostly rendered in 3D and action is more or less in real time. It's easier for, I think, Western style RPGs to blend into the action genre due to these facts. Heck, games like Dark Souls or even Zelda Breath of the Wild can be considered some sort of recombination of RPG elements with straight up action adventure type of games, right? Nothing wrong with this group, but it's not what I'm talking about here, right? What I'm talking about by old school JRPGs are mostly defined by turn-based rather than real-time battle, and yet a heavier emphasis on hand-drawn art over 3D graphics, though as time goes on, 3D elements can certainly be mixed in, right? Point number two. So what are some examples of old school JRPGs, and where do I draw the line between what games I consider to actually be in the genre? Well, to me, the OG type of games in this genre were definitely Final Fantasy 2 and 3 of the world in the US, which was Final Fantasy 4 and 6 in Japan, respectively. Entire other franchises come to mind, like Wild Arms, Suikoden, Persona, or Mega Man Tensei, Shadow Hearts, I think Dragon Quest as well, obviously. I mean, to me, modern Final Fantasy games no longer count as they lean more and more towards the combat and visual styles of MMORPGs, a genre that I personally have like little interest in, right? To me, the games that are in the gray area are Star Ocean and Tales of those series. They're barely in the genre because their combat mechanics are usually more real-time than not. Right? Don't get me wrong. I've actually played a lot of the Star Oceans and the Tales of series. It's just that they don't remind me of the type of nostalgic perfection that I associate with Final Fantasy 3/6. So point number three, what is it about old school RPGs that makes me love them? Well, let's dig into the why a little bit, right? Turn-based combat to me just feels like an easier way to control what actually feels like a whole party, right? Gives you total control over all party members and enough time to strategize that a real-time combat system that I've seen never has been able to accomplish, right? I'm going to use the Tales of series combat mechanic as a comparison. Like in the Tales of series, you control just your main character and give your supporting cast essentially a general direction to follow, right? So even if I was in a party of, say, 4 different, little characters, never do I feel like I have control over all of them at the same time. Really, I just control the main character and hope my support cast's AI does its job adequately. Which, by the way, it never does, right? Because it's AI in a regular video game. Compared to that, to most games in, say, the Final Fantasy series before you get to the number 10, while in the story there's a single protagonist, of course, during actual battles, everyone pitches in equally, and depending on how well one identifies with any controllable character style, it's actually quite easy to identify with someone who's not possibly the main character. Prime example, in Final Fantasy VII, you can recruit this guy called Vincent. He's like some sort of zombie vampire devil type of undead dude. That guy won me over. He's probably my favorite character by design, simply through design and his combat abilities and style, right? Despite being one of the least developed characters in terms of plot and narrative, right? of course, point number 4. I've mentioned old school and traditional here and there and hinted at my love for hand-drawn art over 3D models. This is just me showing my age, right? I love animation, and I grew up with, you know, your characters being shown in super deformed models, right? And they somehow manages to emote better than most of the kind of second-rate 3D models that I've seen in games made a whole decade later, right? Look, I get it. When I first started playing games where you control a character, you know, a party of characters, and I saw that a person is being deformed, being represented as a super deformed, like a big head on a small body, I too wondered when we could get better art that depicts a person more proportionally, right? But then once the advent of 3D models came into place, like Final Fantasy VII was the first 3D Final Fantasy. When that happened, I realized that just because it's in 3D and more proportional to what a person looks like doesn't mean that it's better, right? The proportions were better, but now you're just controlling people who look like mannequins rather than people who can actually emote, right? So instead, I went back to newer games that are designed for nostalgia, right? Current examples are like Octopath Traveler with its beautiful 2D style, or the newer Bravely Default games. It's really the details here that matter to me, right? Like, I'm not against 3D entirely, right? But the only great example where I can think of where a game is primarily on an open world 3D plane, but also has the type of details that I'm looking for, is not even in the strict RPG genre, right? And that example would be Zelda Breath of the Wild, commonly thought of as one of the greatest games ever made. Its combination of 3D models and like hand-drawn cartoony style is just amazing, right? If someone makes a straight-up RPG that looks like that, I'd be all over it. Point number 5. But at the end of the day, when I think about my experience with JRPGs that I've just defined and gave an example for, why do I love them so much when much of the narrative is relatively cliche to me at this point? I think I reached a realization lately, and I will tell you what it is. Like a very simple example, right? I'm playing Bravely Default 2 on the Switch, and I realized that in-game, cutting random patches of grass on the overall world map yields a fair probability of good money and loot. Almost as good as just getting a chest, to be honest. So I'm just going around the game every time I'm in a new area, combing every nook and cranny just to cut the grass. Kind of actually sounds like my real-life chore of mowing the lawn. Like, I realize that, right? So why is it that I dislike mowing the lawn, but does enjoy cutting grass in the game? I think it really boils down to the immediacy of rewards relatively to the amount of time that I spent doing the task, right? Because in real life, I understand that mowing the lawn is important, and it's great for my house in the long run, right? But the long run here is in the time frame of years to decades, whereas in the game, even a simple mini-game, if you can call it that, like cutting the grass, will yield results that I can then use in the next 5 to 30 minutes, right? So when I think I can extrapolate this particular reason to the entirety of the genre, right? I can easily identify why I love these games. They essentially condense like lifelong journeys of adventure down to hours to weeks, right? Rather than what their real life parallel would be, which would be, again, years to decades, right? Anyway, there's no point to this video except to share my love and joy of a genre that's never been as popular as I'd like it to be. Now, I hear in the land of their birth, Japan, it's like a holiday when the next Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy drops. Will that ever happen in the USA? Probably not, but one can hope, right? Subscribe and comment, like and share, and all that jazzy jazz. Cheers.